There's a letter preserved behind glass in a museum in southern Japan. The handwriting is careful, deliberate. It reads, "Mother, thank you for raising me. Please do not cry. If there is another life, I wish to be your son again." The young man who wrote those words was 22 years old. He would be dead within hours of folding the paper and handing it to a superior officer. His plane, loaded with explosives, would plunge into the ocean somewhere near Okinawa. His body was never recovered. We think we know the story of the kamikaze. We've seen the images, heard the tales. Fanatical Japanese pilots in the final desperate months of World War II, diving their explosive-laden aircraft into American warships. Men supposedly eager to die for their emperor, embracing death with a smile, shouting patriotic slogans as they plummeted toward the waves below. The Western imagination has painted them as something almost inhuman, as zealots beyond understanding, as the ultimate expression of a foreign and inscrutable warrior culture. But tonight, I want you to forget everything you think you know about kamikaze pilots. Because the truth, preserved in thousands of final letters, diary entries, and testimonies, tells a profoundly different story. It's a story not about fanaticism, but about young men who desperately wanted to live. It's about pressure so immense that refusal was unthinkable. It's about families torn apart, about mothers who never stopped grieving, about sweethearts who received letters written by hands that trembled not with excitement, but with fear. The kamikaze were not the mindless fanatics of popular imagination. They were students pulled from universities. They were sons who left dinner tables and never returned. They were young men, most barely out of their teens, who wrote letters home that will break your heart. Tonight we're going to read those letters. We're going to understand what it really meant to be chosen as a kamikaze pilot. And by the end, you'll see these young men not as distant historical figures or alien warriors, but as what they truly were: ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, forced to write farewell letters to families they would never see again. This is not a story about heroism, though there was courage involved. This is not a story about fanaticism, though propaganda tried to paint it that way. This is a story about humanity at its most vulnerable, about young lives sacrificed not because they wanted to die, but because they saw no way to live with honor in the world that had been created around them. The Divine Wind, a legend reborn. To understand how thousands of young Japanese men came to fly suicide missions in 1944 and 1945, we need to go back centuries earlier, to a time when Japan faced a different existential threat. The story begins not with aircraft, but with wooden ships and the largest invasion force the world had ever seen. It's the 13th century, and Kublai Khan, grandson of the legendary Genghis Khan, sits as emperor of China's Yuan dynasty. He has conquered China, subjugated Korea, and built the largest empire the world has ever known. But across 100 miles of water lies Japan, an island nation that has never been conquered, never been successfully invaded. For Kublai Khan, this is intolerable. In 1274, the Khan dispatched his first invasion fleet. Contemporary records describe between 500 and 900 ships, carrying somewhere between 30,000 and 40,000 men. These weren't just Mongol warriors, but a multinational force: ethnic Chinese, Koreans, all under Mongol command. The fleet sailed from what is now Busan in South Korea, and by November it had reached Japanese waters. The invasion force first seized the islands of Tsushima and Iki, where local defenders were quickly overwhelmed. The Mongols used weapons the Japanese had never encountered, explosive powder bombs that terrified the defending samurai. When the fleet reached Hakata Bay on the main island of Kyushu, the Japanese defenders found themselves facing a technologically superior enemy with overwhelming numbers. But then something extraordinary happened. As the Mongol commanders prepared for a decisive assault, the weather turned. Historical accounts speak of a sudden violent storm that arose during the night. By morning, the invading fleet was in chaos. Ships had been smashed against the rocky shore. Others had been driven back out to sea. Estimates suggest that 13,000 men drowned, and roughly a third of the ships were destroyed. The survivors had no choice but to retreat to Korea. The Japanese, who had been preparing for almost certain defeat, were stunned by their deliverance. How could they explain this miraculous salvation? In a deeply religious culture, the answer seemed obvious. The gods had intervened. The storm wasn't a random act of nature. It was divine protection. They called it Kamikaze, meaning divine wind. 7 years passed. Japan built defensive walls along vulnerable coastlines, preparing for what they knew would come. And come it did. In 1281, Kublai Khan launched his second invasion, and this time the scale was almost unimaginable. Historical records speak of over 4,000 ships carrying between 70,000 and 140,000 soldiers. This was possibly the largest attempted naval invasion in human history until the D-Day landings of 1944. The invasion force came in two waves, one from Korea, another from southern China. They were supposed to coordinate, but delays caused problems. The Korean fleet arrived first and struggled to find landing sites because of the defensive walls the Japanese had built. As summer turned toward autumn, the combined Mongol fleet found itself trapped offshore, supplies dwindling, unable to break through the Japanese defenses. Then, in mid-August, another massive typhoon struck. This time, the destruction was catastrophic. The flat-bottom barges that had been hastily constructed for the invasion were particularly vulnerable to the violent seas. Ships splintered, men drowned by the thousands. Of the vast invasion force that had set sail with such confidence, only a small fraction ever made it home. Modern estimates suggest that over 70,000 men perished. Again, Japan had been saved by what seemed like divine intervention. The timing was too perfect to be coincidence. Two massive invasion forces, 7 years apart, both destroyed by typhoons at the critical moment. The legend of the Kamikaze, the divine wind that protected Japan from foreign invasion, became central to Japanese national mythology. For centuries, the story was told and retold. It became woven into the cultural fabric of Japan, a tale of a nation protected by the gods themselves, of a land that could never be conquered because heaven itself would rise in its defense. When Japanese children learned history, they learned about the kamikaze typhoons that saved their ancestors from the Mongol hordes. Fast forward to 1944. Japan is losing World War II, and losing badly. The Americans are island hopping across the Pacific. The Japanese Navy has been decimated in battles like Midway and the Philippine Sea. Experienced pilots are dead or dying. Aircraft production can't keep pace with losses. The home islands themselves now face the threat of invasion for the first time in 600 years. In this moment of desperation, military planners reached back into history for inspiration. They remembered the story of divine winds that had saved Japan before, and they asked, could we create our own kamikaze? Could men become the divine wind? In October 1944, the word that had meant a typhoon for 6 centuries was reborn with a new and terrible meaning. Young men, their planes loaded with bombs and extra fuel, would become human missiles, guided weapons aimed at American warships. They would be the new divine wind, the force that would sweep the enemy from the seas and save Japan from invasion, just as the typhoons had done centuries before. The term wasn't used casually. It was propaganda of the highest order, connecting these suicide missions to one of the most powerful stories in Japanese history. When a young pilot was told he would join the kamikaze, he wasn't just being asked to die. He was being told he would become part of legend, that his death would be as meaningful as those ancient typhoons, that he would literally become a divine protector of the nation. But there was a crucial difference between the 13th century kamikaze and the 20th century version. The typhoons of 1274 and 1281 destroyed ships without sacrificing Japanese lives. The human kamikaze of 1944 required the sacrifice of Japan's own sons, its own future, its own young men who had barely begun to live. The descent into desperation. By late 1944, the war had turned catastrophically against Japan. To understand how the kamikaze program came into existence, you have to understand just how dire the situation had become. how thoroughly the Japanese military machine was being ground down by American industrial might and military superiority. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 had been a disaster of almost unimaginable proportions. American pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, and the name was grimly accurate. In a single day, American fighters shot down an estimated 243 Japanese aircraft, while losing only 15 of their own in air-to-air combat. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. And it wasn't just the planes that were lost. Those aircraft had carried Japan's remaining experienced pilots, men who had trained for years, who understood combat tactics, who had the skill to have a fighting chance against American aviators. The problem was simple but insurmountable. Japan could not replace these pilots fast enough. A skilled combat pilot requires extensive training, hundreds of hours of flight time, practice with tactics and weapon systems. Japan no longer had the fuel, the time, or the instructors to provide such training. New pilots were being rushed through accelerated programs, sometimes receiving as little as 30 to 50 hours of total flight time before being sent into combat. American pilots, by contrast, often had several hundred hours of training before they ever saw combat. The aircraft themselves were becoming obsolete. While American factories churned out advanced fighters like the F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair, Japan was increasingly relying on older designs and even training aircraft pressed into combat roles. The technological gap was widening with each passing month. Then there was the fundamental mathematics of attrition. America could afford losses. Its industrial base was untouched by war, its factories producing aircraft, ships, and weapons at rates Japan couldn't hope to match. If America lost 100 planes in a battle, those planes would be replaced within weeks. If Japan lost 100 planes, that loss represented an irreplaceable hemorrhage of military power. By October 1944, as American forces prepared to invade the Philippines, Japanese military planners faced an awful truth. Conventional air tactics had become almost useless. When inexperienced pilots in inferior aircraft tried to attack American ships, protected by superior fighters and dense anti-aircraft fire, the result was predictable. Most Japanese aircraft were shot down before ever reaching their targets. The few that did get through rarely caused significant damage. This was the context in which Captain Motoharu Okamura made his fateful proposal. Okamura was in charge of the Tateyama Air Base near Tokyo and commanded the 341st Air Group. He had watched Japanese air power being systematically destroyed, had seen young pilots going out and never returning, had witnessed the futility of conventional attacks. And he came to a radical conclusion. If Japanese pilots couldn't survive long enough to drop bombs and escape, why not eliminate the escape phase entirely? Why not turn the aircraft itself into the bomb, with the pilot guiding it all the way to impact? Such an attack would be far more accurate than a conventional bombing run. A determined pilot could make course corrections right up to the moment of impact, could adjust for a ship's evasive maneuvers, could guarantee that if he reached his target, he would hit it. Okamura wasn't alone in this thinking. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who commanded the First Air Fleet in the Philippines, independently reached similar conclusions. When the American invasion of the Philippines began in October 1944, Onishi found himself with just 40 operational aircraft against an American fleet that could deploy over 1,000 fighters. Conventional tactics would be suicide with no hope of inflicting meaningful damage, but suicide attacks, properly organized and executed, might sink enough ships to give Japan a chance. On October 19, 1944, Onishi gathered his officers and made his proposal. He wanted to form special attack units, pilots who would deliberately crash their explosive-laden aircraft into American carriers. The impact, he calculated, would be devastating. Even if most of the attacks failed, even if only 1 in 5 pilots reached their targets, the damage to American morale and materiel would be worth the cost. The key word in Onishi's proposal was volunteer. He was asking for men to step forward and embrace certain death. In Japanese military culture, with its emphasis on honor, duty, and sacrifice for the emperor, he knew he would get his volunteers. What he perhaps didn't fully anticipate was how the lines between true volunteering and coercion would blur. The first volunteers came forward almost immediately. 24 pilots from the 201st Air Group were approached by their commanding officer about forming a special attack unit. Not one of them refused. Whether this was genuine enthusiasm, social pressure, or an understanding that refusal would be seen as cowardice, we can never know for certain. But the first Kamikaze unit was formed, and on October 25, 1944, they flew their first mission. The results exceeded even the optimistic predictions. Several ships were hit, and the escort carrier USS St. Lo was sunk, becoming the first major American warship destroyed by a kamikaze attack. The psychological impact was profound. American sailors, who had faced conventional air attacks throughout the war, were shaken by the sight of pilots deliberately flying into their ships. There was no way to reason with such an enemy, no way to intimidate or frighten them into turning away. Either you shot them down, or they hit you. High command in Tokyo took notice. If a handful of pilots in outdated aircraft could sink a carrier, what could hundreds of such pilots accomplish? The Kamikaze program expanded rapidly. More units were formed. More pilots were recruited. And as the program grew, the nature of that recruitment became increasingly complex and troubling. The official line was always that kamikaze pilots were volunteers, men who stepped forward eagerly to sacrifice themselves for emperor and country. The reality was far more complicated. Many pilots were indeed motivated by genuine patriotism and a sense of duty, but many others were subjected to pressure so intense that refusal became psychologically impossible. The recruitment process often involved a simple questionnaire. Pilots would be lined up and given a slip of paper with three options: to volunteer out of strong desire, to simply volunteer, or to decline. But here was the catch. They had to sign their name to their choice. In a military culture where honor meant everything, where family reputation could be destroyed by a single act of perceived cowardice, how could a young man check the decline box and sign his name to it, knowing everyone would see? Some pilots described the experience in their diaries. They knew what was being asked of them. They didn't want to die. But surrounded by their comrades, watched by their officers, carrying the weight of their family's honor and centuries of military tradition, they found themselves writing their names next to volunteer. Was this truly volunteering, or was it coercion dressed up as choice? Those who did refuse, or who hesitated, faced consequences. Some were beaten, others were publicly humiliated, called cowards, subjected to psychological pressure until they changed their minds. Some were told their families would face social ostracism or worse. A few who persistently refused were transferred to ground units and sent to island garrisons where death in combat was equally certain. The message was clear. One way or another, you were going to die. You could die as a kamikaze and be remembered as a hero, or you could die some other way and be remembered as a coward. The training these new kamikaze pilots received was minimal and in some ways deliberately brutal. They learned to take off, but often not to land. They practiced shallow diving attacks but received little of the comprehensive flight training that would have made them capable combat pilots. Some testimonies describe training that involved constant physical punishment, beatings designed to harden the pilots and break down their natural instinct for self-preservation. The psychological conditioning was equally systematic. Pilots were bombarded with propaganda about the glory of dying for the emperor. They were told their deaths would save Japan, would protect their families, would earn them an honored place at Yasukuni Shrine where the war dead were venerated. They were encouraged to write letters home expressing their joy at the opportunity to serve. Many did write such letters, but surviving diaries and uncensored writings reveal that the reality was far more complex. The weight of final words. Every kamikaze pilot was granted one final privilege before his mission: the right to write letters home. These weren't casual notes dashed off in spare moments. They were last words, final messages that would have to carry years of unspoken feelings, express a lifetime of gratitude and love, and somehow make sense of a death that most of these young men didn't fully understand themselves. Today, thousands of these letters are preserved in museums across Japan, particularly at the Chiran Peace Museum in Kagoshima Prefecture. which served as one of the primary kamikaze bases. When you stand in that museum and look at the photographs of the pilots, what strikes you first is how young they were. Many look like they should be in high school, not flying suicide missions. The youngest confirmed kamikaze pilot was Yasuo Tanaka, who was just 16 years old when he died. The oldest was 32, ancient by kamikaze standards. The letters themselves vary wildly in tone and content. Some are short, almost businesslike in their brevity. Others run for pages, cramped handwriting filling every available space as if the writer couldn't bear to stop, knowing that once he put down the pen, that would be it. No more chances to communicate with the people he loved. But certain themes appear again and again, threading through these final messages, like a mournful melody. The most common theme is apology. Not apology for dying exactly, but apology for not being a better son, a more devoted brother, a more attentive husband. Second Lieutenant Fujio Wakamatsu wrote to his mother, "Mother, I have nothing to say. In my last moment and my first act of filial piety, I will smile and conquer. With dry eyes and knowing I have done well, please offer some rice dumplings at our Buddhist mortuary tablet." The reference to first act of filial piety is heartbreaking. He's apologizing for not being a good enough son during his life and promising that his death will finally make up for those perceived shortcomings. Many pilots wrote specifically to their mothers, and these letters are perhaps the most emotionally devastating of all. There's a particular letter from a pilot whose name has been lost to history, but whose words survive. "Mother, thank you for raising me. Please do not cry. If there is another life, I wish to be your son again." Imagine receiving that letter. Imagine learning that your son is dead and reading those words, knowing they were written just hours before he climbed into a plane. He would never leave. Lieutenant Kishi Fumikazu wrote to his siblings, asking them to give their mother the love he cannot give. He died in the Philippines in October 1944, one of the earliest kamikaze casualties. His letter spoke of autumn, of insects crying in the backyard, of quiet evenings spent talking with his family. These mundane memories took on profound significance as his final moments approached. The ordinary rhythms of family life became precious beyond measure when seen from the threshold of death. Some of the most heart-wrenching letters were written to fathers. These often had a different tone than the letters to mothers, more formal, more concerned with honor and duty. One pilot wrote, "Father, I'm not brave. I am going only so I do not bring shame upon you." This sentence cuts through all the propaganda about eager sacrifice and reveals the naked truth. Many of these young men were not flying to their deaths because they wanted to, but because they feared the shame that would fall on their families if they refused. For married pilots, the letters to wives carried a special agony. These were men leaving behind the women they loved, sometimes after just weeks or months of marriage. Second Lieutenant Masashi Ohira wrote to his wife Fukuko before attacking Allied ships near Okinawa. "Fukuko, for a long time you did your very best as a person who wanted to care for me. To me, you were a wife who was superior. You were a wife who was too good for me. At the end, I am thankful. I did not know a woman except for you." Flight Lieutenant Haruo Araki had been married for exactly 1 month when he flew his final mission. His wedding ceremony had been held in tears, in the middle of the night, because he had returned home on sudden leave, and everyone knew he was in a special attack squadron. He spent 4 hours with his new wife Shigeko before returning to base. His final letter to her reads, "Are you well? It is now a month since that day. The happy dream is over. Tomorrow I will dive my plane into an enemy ship. I will cross the river into the other world, taking some Yankees with me. When I look back, I see that I was very cold-hearted to you. After I had been cruel to you, I used to regret it. Please forgive me." Araki was one of the 2 pilots who struck the aircraft carrier USS Bunker Hill on May 11, 1945, causing fires that killed 396 American sailors. His widow, carrying their unborn child, later said that at the time she felt proud of his sacrifice, that it would have been shameful for him to go on living. Only years later, after the war, did she begin to question whether his death had achieved anything meaningful, whether he still lay at the bottom of the cold Okinawan Sea, for nothing. For pilots who had children, the letters took on yet another dimension of tragedy. These men were writing to children who might not even remember them, trying to leave some piece of themselves behind. One pilot wrote to his infant daughter, "Motoko, when you grow up and want to know about me, ask your mother and Aunt Keo. I also left my photo album at home for you. It was I who named you Motoko. I thought of you as becoming a gentle, kind, and sensitive person. I want to see you grow up to be a splendid bride, but even if I die without your knowing me, you must not grieve. When you get older and want to see me, come to Kudan and pray with all your heart, and my face will appear before you." The reference to Kudan is particularly poignant. Kudan is the location of Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, where the souls of Japan's war dead were said to reside. The pilot is telling his daughter that if she wants to see her father, she must pray at a shrine to the dead, because that's the only place he'll exist for her. She will have no living memory of him, only this letter and a photo album. Not all letters were purely emotional. Some pilots tried to give practical advice to fulfill their role as provider and protector even in death. They reminded their families to care for elderly relatives, told brothers to study hard and serve the country well, advised wives on financial matters, or asked them to remarry and find happiness. These practical concerns, sandwiched between declarations of love and apologies for dying, reveal men trying desperately to maintain their connection to the world even as they prepared to leave it forever. What's particularly striking about many letters is what they don't say. Very few contain the kind of fanatical, patriotic rhetoric that propaganda films would have us expect. There are relatively few mentions of glorious death or eager sacrifice. Instead, there's often a quiet resignation, an acknowledgement that this is happening whether they want it or not, and an attempt to make the best of it by focusing on duty and honor. Some pilots were more candid in their personal diaries than in their official letters home. One wrote, "I am not a volunteer, but I did not have the courage to refuse." Another recorded his true feelings while maintaining a brave face in his formal correspondence. These private writings reveal the cognitive dissonance that many kamikaze pilots experienced, the gap between what they truly felt and what they were expected to express. Military censors often reviewed letters before they were sent, and anything deemed too negative or insufficiently patriotic might be removed. Some families received letters with sections blacked out or cut away. They could only imagine what their sons or husbands had written in those missing passages, what truths had been deemed too dangerous to let reach the home front. A few pilots included physical mementos with their letters, a lock of hair carefully wrapped in paper, a ring that had belonged to their mother, now being returned, a photograph taken during training showing a young man in pilot's uniform trying to smile. These objects, preserved alongside the letters, are unbearably intimate. You can almost feel the hands that held them. The young man sitting alone in a barracks, carefully cutting a lock of his own hair and folding it into the paper, knowing this might be the only physical piece of himself that his family would ever have to bury. Second Lieutenant Toshio Kuramoto wrote to his wife Kimiko, "Kimiko, please forgive me for the time of departure. Only because I loved you, my heart was filled with the desire to not cause you sadness for a while." He had tried to hide from her that he was in a special attack unit, telling her repeatedly that he was just on training flights. But when his final mission came, he could no longer maintain the deception. The love in that letter is palpable, but so is the anguish of a man who knows he's about to shatter the heart of someone he loves. Not every letter was somber. Some pilots tried to maintain their spirits and those of their families. 18-year-old Torao Kato wrote in bold brushstrokes, "Dearest mother, please live a long life full of vigor. I will try to destroy a big one." There's almost a boyish bravado in those words, a young man trying to make his death sound like an adventure, trying to spare his mother the full weight of grief by pretending this is all somehow okay. But perhaps the most revealing letters are the ones that express doubt, that question the purpose of their sacrifice. These were rare because such thoughts were dangerous to express, but they exist. One pilot wrote privately, "Tomorrow, one believer in democracy will leave this world. He may look lonely, but his heart is filled with satisfaction. The reference to democracy is startling. This was a pilot who had been exposed to Western ideas, who perhaps understood that Japan's military government was not the divine institution it claimed to be, yet he was still going to die for it. Reading these letters today, more than 7 decades later, what comes through most powerfully is not fanaticism or joy in sacrifice, but a profound sense of waste. These were educated young men, many of them university students who had been studying literature, science, philosophy. They could write beautifully, express complex emotions, think critically about their situation. They had their whole lives ahead of them, and they knew it. And that knowledge makes their letters all the more heartbreaking. The final hours. The night before a kamikaze mission was unlike any other. Pilots who survived the war because of mechanical failures or because Japan surrendered before their turn came have described those hours in detail, and their accounts reveal a reality far removed from the propaganda image of eager warriors calmly awaiting their glorious deaths. At bases like Chiran, pilots designated for the next day's mission would be moved to special barracks. The atmosphere was strange, almost surreal. Some men tried to maintain normalcy, joking and talking as if this were just another day. Others fell silent, retreating into themselves, processing what was about to happen. A few broke down completely, weeping or shaking, unable to maintain the facade of calm acceptance. The base would provide sake or special food for the departing pilots, a final meal that was meant to be celebratory, but often felt more like a last meal before an execution. Pilots were expected to drink and be cheerful, to show no fear or hesitation. But witnesses later recalled that the forced gaiety often had a desperate quality, like actors in a play who couldn't quite believe their own lines. Some pilots spent their last night writing and rewriting their letters, trying to find the perfect words that would somehow encompass everything they wanted to say. Others sat with photographs of their families, memorizing faces they would never see again. A few wrote poems following the samurai tradition of composing a death poem before facing one's end. There were rituals to observe. Each pilot would receive a white headband, a hachimaki, often inscribed with patriotic slogans or the rising sun symbol. They would put on their uniforms carefully, making sure everything was perfect. Some carried small personal items, a photograph, a letter from home, a good luck charm. These items would burn with them or sink into the ocean, never to be recovered. The night before, some pilots would be photographed either alone or in groups. If you look at these photographs today, preserved in museums, you can see the strain on many faces. Some manage genuine smiles, perhaps finding some peace in their final hours. Others stare at the camera with expressions that are hard to read. Resignation, fear, determination, all mixed together. A few look much younger than their years. Boys playing dress-up in uniforms too big for them, trying to be brave. One famous photograph shows a young kamikaze pilot petting a puppy just hours before his mission. He's smiling, and the image has a poignant innocence to it. This was a man who liked dogs, who perhaps had pets at home, who in other circumstances would have lived a long life, maybe married, had children and grandchildren, grown old petting his own dogs in his own garden. Instead, he petted someone else's puppy one last time and then climbed into an aircraft and died. As morning approached, the reality became inescapable. Pilots would be woken early, long before dawn. They would go through final checks of their aircraft, though in many cases this was pro forma. The planes were often old and worn, patched together from spare parts, barely airworthy. Some pilots knew their aircraft were unlikely to make it to the target even if they weren't shot down, but voicing such concerns was impossible. You checked your plane, nodded that everything was acceptable, and moved on. The final briefing would lay out the target, which part of the American fleet to aim for, what altitude to approach from, how to make the final dive. Pilots were told to aim for the flight decks of carriers if possible, as these were the most vulnerable areas. They were reminded that accuracy mattered, that their deaths would only be meaningful if they hit something significant. Then came the ceremonial sake served in small cups. Pilots would drink together, a final bonding moment with the men who would die alongside them. Some accounts mention that pilots who were particularly anxious or fearful would be encouraged to drink more, to dull. their terror and make it more likely they would go through with the mission. The walk to the aircraft was perhaps the hardest part. This was when it all became real, when there was no more putting off or pretending. Some pilots maintained their composure, walking steadily, even joking with ground crew. Others had to be practically supported, their legs barely able to carry them. A few accounts mention pilots who broke down completely at this point, who had to be physically placed in their cockpits by their commanding officers. There's a particularly brutal detail in some accounts. Pilots who were too terrified to complete their mission might be pushed into their planes, the canopy locked from outside so they couldn't climb back out. Whether this actually happened or is apocryphal is debated by historians, but the fact that such stories exist suggests how complex the reality of volunteering really was. Once in the cockpit, pilots went through their pre-flight checks. Some photographs and accounts describe pilots crying as they prepared to take off, tears streaming down their faces even as they went through the mechanical process of starting their engines and checking their instruments. Others appeared eerily calm, perhaps having achieved some kind of psychological dissociation from what was happening. Young women from local high schools would sometimes be brought to the airfield to wave goodbye and wish the pilots well. These girls, themselves teenagers, would stand by the runway with flowers and patriotic banners, performing the role assigned to them by the military. The juxtaposition is painful to contemplate. Children waving goodbye to other children, all of them caught in a machine that was consuming Japan's youth. The takeoff itself was often ragged. Remember, many of these pilots had minimal training. Some had never made a combat takeoff before. Their planes were overloaded with bombs and fuel, making them sluggish and difficult to handle. Crashes on takeoff were not uncommon, and these deaths were particularly tragic because they accomplished nothing, didn't even get the pilot close to the enemy. For those who successfully got airborne, there would be a moment of calm. They were flying, which many of them loved. The ground fell away, and for a brief time they were just pilots in aircraft, not condemned men on suicide missions. Some survivors recalled feeling almost peaceful during this phase, grateful for a few more hours of life, watching the sun rise over the ocean. But that peace couldn't last. Soon they would see the American fleet on the horizon. Escort fighters would begin to appear, F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs that would shoot down the majority of kamikaze aircraft long before they reached their targets. Anti-aircraft fire would fill the sky with black bursts of flak. The peaceful morning flight would transform into a terrifying gauntlet of death. Most kamikaze pilots never made it to their targets. Statistics vary, but estimates suggest that only about 13 to 19% of kamikaze attacks succeeded in hitting a ship. The rest were shot down by fighters or anti-aircraft fire, sometimes miles from their intended targets. These men died alone, their planes exploding or spinning into the ocean, accomplishing nothing, unknown even to the enemy they were trying to kill. For the minority who did get close enough to dive on a target, the final moments must have been extraordinary. They would push their aircraft into a steep dive, fighting to keep it under control as speed increased and enemy fire intensified. In the last seconds, some pilots may have experienced regret, may have wanted to pull up, to choose life over death. But by then, it was too late. The plane was committed to its dive, and within moments, it would either hit the target or miss and plunge into the sea. We know from American accounts that some pilots appeared to hesitate at the last moment, their aircraft wobbling or pulling up, slightly before diving again. Whether this was loss of nerve, damage from anti-aircraft fire, or simple inexperience with such high-speed dives, we can never know. But it suggests that even in those final seconds, the human instinct for survival was fighting against the training and indoctrination. When a kamikaze did hit a ship, the results could be devastating. The combination of aircraft, fuel, and bomb creating a massive explosion. American sailors caught in these attacks faced horrible deaths from fire, explosion, or drowning. The USS Bunker Hill, hit by 2 kamikazes including possibly Haruo Araki, suffered 396 dead and 264 wounded. The USS Franklin, struck by conventional bombs rather than kamikazes but giving an idea of fire damage potential, lost over 800 men. But for every successful attack there were 4 or 5 failures. 4 or 5 young Japanese pilots who died having accomplished nothing. Their names might be recorded at Yasukuni Shrine, their families might receive notice of their glorious deaths, but the reality was grimmer. They had died because Japan's military leadership, faced with inevitable defeat, had decided that suicide attacks were a viable strategy. What happened to those who returned? Perhaps nothing reveals the true nature of the Kamikaze program more clearly than what happened to pilots who survived their missions. Because despite the mythology of eager sacrifice and certain death, not every kamikaze pilot died on his first mission. Mechanical failures, weather conditions, inability to locate targets, damage from enemy fire that forced a retreat, all these could result in a pilot returning to base alive. For a pilot who returned, the reception was often harsh and humiliating. In a culture that had elevated kamikaze sacrifice to a sacred duty, survival could be interpreted as failure or even cowardice. Upon landing, the pilot would face immediate interrogation from superior officers demanding to know why he had not completed his mission. If the reason was mechanical failure or weather, the pilot might be viewed with suspicion, but ultimately cleared. After all, there was no point in dying if your bomb wouldn't explode or if you couldn't find the enemy fleet in heavy clouds. But even in these cases, there was often an undertone of disappointment, a sense that a real warrior would have found a way to complete his mission, regardless of circumstances. If the failure appeared to be due to hesitation or loss of nerve, the consequences could be severe. Some pilots who returned multiple times were beaten, subjected to psychological abuse, or publicly humiliated. The shame was intended to ensure that on the next attempt, the pilot would complete his mission rather than face such treatment again. Some accounts mention pilots being placed in special squadrons with others who had returned, creating intense peer pressure to succeed on the next attempt. The families of pilots who returned might also face social pressure or ostracism. In a community where one's honor reflected on the entire family, having a son who had failed to complete a kamikaze mission could be socially devastating. This created additional pressure on the pilot to succeed next time, not just for his own honor, but for his family's reputation. One documented case involves a pilot who failed to complete his mission 9 separate times due to various circumstances. Eventually, he was executed for what was deemed cowardice or unwillingness to fulfill his duty. How much of his repeated failure was genuine bad luck, mechanical problems, or weather issues, and how much was unconscious self-preservation or deliberate sabotage, we can never know. But his execution sent a clear message. Returning alive too many times was not acceptable. Some pilots who survived multiple missions developed a fatalistic attitude. They knew they were going to die. It was just a question of when. The psychological toll of repeatedly preparing for death, flying toward the enemy, and then returning to do it all over again was immense. It was like being on death row with an execution date that kept getting postponed. A few pilots managed to survive the entire war, either because Japan surrendered before their final mission or because they were grounded due to lack of aircraft or fuel in the war's final weeks. For these men, the end of the war brought relief but also complicated emotions. They had been prepared to die, had written their farewell letters, had said goodbye to their families. Now they had to somehow pick up the threads of a normal life. Post-war, many surviving kamikaze pilots struggled to reintegrate into Japanese society. Some felt guilty that they had survived when so many of their comrades had died. This survivor's guilt could be crippling, leading to depression, alcoholism, or suicide. They had been told their entire worth lay in dying for the emperor. So what was their value now that they had failed to die? Others faced social stigma of a different kind. In the immediate post-war period, as Japan grappled with its defeat and occupation, attitudes toward the military shifted dramatically. What had been portrayed as glorious sacrifice now seemed like tragic waste. Former kamikaze pilots sometimes found themselves viewed not as heroes, but as reminders of a dark period in Japanese history that many wanted to forget. Some survivors refused to speak about their experiences for decades. The memories were too painful, the emotions too complex. Only in old age did some begin to share their stories, often motivated by a desire to ensure that younger generations understood what really happened, that the sanitized propaganda version of eager sacrifice gave way to a more nuanced and human truth. One survivor who did speak publicly was Kazuo Odachi, who trained as a kamikaze pilot but never flew a mission because the war ended. In interviews conducted when he was elderly, he described the intense pressure, the fear, the sense of being trapped in circumstances beyond his control. He spoke of friends who died, of the relief he felt when surrender came, but also the guilt that he had lived when so many others had not. Another survivor who had been designated for the Kaiten program, human torpedoes, another suicide weapon, described the psychological manipulation they underwent. They were shown propaganda films glorifying sacrifice, subjected to constant indoctrination, and kept isolated from anyone who might express doubts. The training was designed to break down normal human reluctance to die and replace it with a sense that death was not just acceptable, but desirable. For families of kamikaze pilots, both those who died and those who survived, the aftermath of war was complicated. The mothers who received those final letters had to live with them for the rest of their lives, reading and rereading words written by sons who would never age, never marry, never give them grandchildren. Some mothers kept their sons' rooms unchanged for decades, shrines to young men frozen in time. Widows like Haruo Araki's wife Shigeko had to rebuild their lives while carrying the memory of brief marriages that ended in tragedy. Shigeko did remarry and have other children, but she never forgot Haruo or the 4 hours they spent together as husband and wife. In old age, she questioned whether his sacrifice had been worth it, whether the whole kamikaze program had been anything more than a futile gesture by leaders who refused to accept defeat. The children who grew up never knowing their fathers or barely remembering them faced their own challenges. Some grew up with an idealized image of heroic fathers who died gloriously for their country. Others, as they learned more about the reality of the kamikaze program, came to see their fathers more as victims than heroes. This shift in perspective could be painful, requiring them to reconcile childhood myths with adult understanding. The machines behind the men. To fully understand the kamikaze experience, we need to understand the aircraft they flew. These weren't gleaming, state-of-the-art machines piloted by expert aviators. By late 1944 and early 1945, Japan was scraping the bottom of the barrel, converting training aircraft and obsolete fighters into suicide weapons because they had nothing else left. The iconic kamikaze aircraft was the Mitsubishi A6M0, which had been Japan's premier fighter in the early years of the war. But by 1945, Zeros were obsolete, outclassed by American fighters in every category except maneuverability at low speeds. The Zeros being used for kamikaze missions were often worn-out aircraft that had survived years of combat use in harsh conditions, held together with patches and prayers. Other aircraft pressed into kamikaze service included the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, the Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien, and the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate. These were all legitimate fighter aircraft in their prime, but by 1945 many were past their prime, suffering from lack of maintenance, poor quality fuel, and inexperienced pilots who didn't know how to get the best performance from them. Even more desperate were the training aircraft converted into kamikaze planes. Biplanes and light monoplanes designed for teaching student pilots were loaded with whatever bombs could be attached and sent out with minimal trained pilots at the controls. These aircraft were slow, lightly built, easy targets for American fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Pilots flying such planes had almost no chance of reaching their targets. Then there was the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, perhaps the most infamous purpose-built kamikaze weapon. The Oka, whose name meant cherry blossom, but which American pilots called the Baka, Japanese for fool or idiot, was essentially a manned missile. It was a small aircraft powered by 3 solid fuel rockets, carried beneath a twin-engine bomber until near the target, then released for its final dive. The Oka was theoretically capable of reaching speeds over 400 miles per hour in its terminal dive, making it almost impossible to intercept or evade. But in practice, the system was deeply flawed. The bombers carrying the Oka were slow and vulnerable, often shot down long before they could release their deadly payload. The Oka pilots would die, not in a glorious dive into an enemy ship, but sitting helpless in a bomb under a bomber's belly, as American fighters shredded the aircraft. The first Oka mission in March 1945 was a disaster. 18 bombers carrying 15 Oka units took off protected by 30 fighters. They were intercepted by 50 American fighters before the Okas could be released. All 18 bombers were shot down. All 15 Oka pilots died, along with the bomber crews, having accomplished nothing. For the pilots, these aircraft represented their final moments of life. Some accounts mention pilots spending time with their assigned aircraft before their mission, almost as if saying goodbye to a companion that would share their death. They would check over the plane, make sure the bomb was properly attached, that everything was as ready as it could be. The aircraft were typically loaded with a single large bomb, usually 250 or 500 kilograms, along with extra fuel to extend range. This extra weight made the plane sluggish and difficult to handle, especially for inexperienced pilots. Takeoffs were dangerous, the overloaded aircraft struggling to get airborne. Once in the air, the planes handled poorly, with degraded maneuverability that made them even more vulnerable to American fighters. Most kamikaze aircraft had their radios disabled or removed. This was partly to save weight, but also to prevent pilots from communicating with each other or with base during the mission. The authorities didn't want pilots talking each other out of their missions or calling back to express doubts. They were to fly in silence, alone with their thoughts toward their deaths. In the cockpit, pilots would find the controls stripped to basics. Complex instruments that required training to read were often removed or disabled. The pilot needed to know his altitude, his speed, his fuel level, and little else. The simplification was practical given the minimal training, but it also reinforced the idea that these weren't real pilots on real missions. They were guided missiles that happened to be made of flesh and bone. Some aircraft had additional armor installed around the pilot's seat and fuel tanks, not to protect the pilot, who was expected to die, but to increase the chances the aircraft would survive enemy fire long enough to reach its target. From a certain cold-blooded perspective, it made sense. Protecting the pilot was pointless, but protecting the bomb delivery system, which happened to include a pilot, was logical. The human cost in numbers. Let's talk about statistics, because while individual stories are moving, the scale of the Kamikaze program only becomes clear when we look at the numbers, and those numbers are staggering. From October 1944 to August 1945, approximately 3,800 kamikaze pilots died in suicide attacks. That's 3,800 young men, mostly in their late teens and early 20s, who died deliberately flying aircraft into ships or crashing into the ocean short of their targets. To put that in perspective, that's roughly the equivalent of wiping out the entire student body of a medium-sized American university. But 3,800 deaths don't tell the full story. Many more were designated as kamikaze pilots, but never flew their final missions because the war ended first or because their missions were repeatedly canceled due to weather, mechanical problems, or lack of fuel. Estimates suggest that as many as 6,000 to 8,000 pilots were trained and designated for kamikaze missions during the program's existence. Of the 1,036 Army kamikaze pilots who died during the Battle of Okinawa, specifically 439 flew from Chiran Air Base. Of those, 335 were classified as young boy pilots, teenagers who had joined Air Force training at age 14 and were barely 17 or 18 when they died. More than a third of them were mere children by modern standards. The youngest confirmed kamikaze pilot was 16-year-old Yasuo Tanaka, who flew an Oka cherry blossom rocket bomb on May 11, 1945. His target was never recorded. His plane, his bomb, and his 16-year-old body all ended up at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, never to be recovered. The oldest kamikaze was 32-year-old Army Lieutenant Colonel Yoshio Itsui, who led the first flights from Chiran on April 1, 1945. He left behind a wife and 3 small children, including an infant son. When news of his death reached home, his wife was so devastated that she could no longer produce milk to feed their baby. The infant died of malnutrition 4 months later, so Itsui's kamikaze mission actually killed not 1, but 2 members of his family. On the American side, kamikaze attacks killed over 7,000 Allied naval personnel during the course of the program. They sank or damaged several dozen ships, though the effectiveness varied greatly depending on the phase of the war and the specific battle. During the Battle of Okinawa, kamikaze attacks sank 36 American ships and damaged 368 others, inflicting approximately 10,000 casualties, with half of those being deaths. But here's the crucial statistic. Only about 13 to 19% of kamikaze attacks actually hit their targets. That means for every pilot who succeeded in crashing into a ship, 4 or 5 others died without accomplishing anything. Their planes were shot down miles from their targets, or they missed and plunged into empty ocean, or mechanical failures caused them to crash on takeoff or shortly after. Think about what that means. The vast majority of kamikaze pilots died having accomplished nothing tactically significant. They were killed by American fighters, blown apart by anti-aircraft fire, or disappeared into the Pacific without ever getting close to an enemy ship. Their sacrifice, which they had been told would be glorious and meaningful, often ended up being pointless. Even for the 13 to 19% who did hit ships, the strategic impact was limited. Despite causing significant casualties and damage, the kamikaze program failed to halt the American advance or prevent the invasion of Okinawa. It didn't save Japan from defeat. If anything, it probably accelerated Japan's collapse by stripping the military of trained pilots who could have been more useful in conventional defensive operations. Admiral William Bull Halsey, whose Third Fleet was repeatedly attacked by kamikazes, later assessed their impact. The kamikaze attacks were the most frightening and dramatic form of warfare we had ever experienced, but from a practical standpoint, they were not as effective as conventional bombing attacks. This from an American admiral who witnessed the attacks firsthand. Another grim statistic, the success rate of kamikaze attacks actually decreased over time as American forces developed better defensive tactics. During the Philippines campaign in October to November 1944, about 27% of kamikaze attacks resulted in hits or near misses. By the Okinawa campaign in April to June 1945, that rate had dropped to around 13%. The pilots were dying at the same rate, but accomplishing less and less. From Japan's perspective, the program consumed its remaining pilots at an unsustainable rate. By mid-1945, there were more kamikaze missions scheduled than there were pilots to fly them, more than there were aircraft available. The country was literally running out of young men to throw away in suicide attacks. Modern Japan's reckoning today, more than 7 decades after the last kamikaze mission, Japan's relationship with this chapter of its history remains complex and often controversial. The kamikaze program represents perhaps the starkest example of how far Japan's military government was willing to go in pursuit of a war it had already lost. The Chiran Peace Museum, built at the site of one of the primary kamikaze bases, opened in 1975 and was expanded in 1986. It houses over 4,500 artifacts related to kamikaze pilots, including the famous letters, personal effects, and 4 aircraft, including a damaged Mitsubishi Zero recovered from the seabed. The museum is lined with more than 1,000 stone lanterns, one for each pilot who died. The stated purpose of the museum is to commemorate the pilots and expose the tragic loss of their lives so that we may understand the need for everlasting peace and ensure such incidents are never repeated. This language is carefully chosen, presenting the pilots as tragic victims whose sacrifice should teach us about the costs of war, rather than as heroes whose actions should be emulated. When Japanese schoolchildren visit the museum today, their reactions are telling. Many visitor comments preserved by the museum express sadness and a determination to value peace. One elementary school student wrote, "I want to cherish life more. I am glad I came here." A high school student reflected, "I think that in order to hope for peace, we need to learn more about the thoughts and feelings of these soldiers so that we can prevent them from repeating them. I don't want the death of a young man who cared for his family to the end to be in vain." But the museum and others like it remain controversial. Some Japanese citizens feel they glorify militarism and whitewash the aggressive wars Japan fought in Asia. Others argue they're important historical records that humanize the pilots without necessarily endorsing the war itself. The debate reflects larger arguments within Japanese society about how to remember and teach about World War II. At Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, where the souls of Japan's war dead are said to reside, The kamikaze pilots are honored alongside all other Japanese who died in military service. But Yasukuni itself is controversial, criticized for also honoring war criminals and presenting a nationalist view of Japanese military history. Visits to Yasukuni by Japanese politicians regularly triggered diplomatic protests from China and Korea, countries that suffered under Japanese military occupation. For many surviving kamikaze pilots and their families, the post-war period has been one of silence more than remembrance. The subject was too painful, too tied up with Japan's defeat and occupation, too complicated to discuss openly. Many survivors simply tried to move on with their lives, getting jobs, marrying, having families, and burying their wartime experiences deep inside. Only as these survivors reach very old age have some begun to speak publicly about their experiences. Motivated partly by approaching mortality and partly by a desire to set the record straight, they've given interviews, written memoirs, participated in documentaries. Their accounts have helped historians understand that the propaganda image of eager sacrifice was always a lie, that the reality was far more complicated and tragic. Modern historians studying the kamikaze program have come to see it as emblematic of Japanese militarism's fundamental problems: the willingness to throw away lives in futile gestures rather than admit defeat. The prioritization of abstract concepts like honor over the concrete reality of thousands of young men dying for nothing. The disconnect between military leadership, safe in their bunkers in Tokyo, and the pilots they were sending to certain death. Some historians also point out the hypocrisy of the kamikaze program's architects. The officers who designed and implemented the program, who made speeches about the glory of sacrifice, who pressured young men into volunteering, almost none of them flew kamikaze missions themselves. They asked others to do what they themselves would not do, to die cause that was already lost while they planned to survive the war. The kamikaze program has also entered Western popular culture, but often in problematic ways. The image of the kamikaze pilot as fanatic or suicide bomber, unthinking and inhuman, remains persistent. This image serves a purpose in justifying the war and in creating a clear moral distinction between us and them. But it does a profound disservice to historical truth and to the memory of the actual men who flew those missions. More recently, there's been increasing recognition that equating kamikaze pilots with modern suicide bombers is unfair and inaccurate. Suicide bombers typically target civilians deliberately and act from religious extremism. Kamikaze pilots targeted military objectives exclusively and acted not from religious fanaticism, but from a complex mix of patriotism, social pressure, and an understanding that refusal would bring dishonor to themselves and their families. The letters that kamikaze pilots left behind have been crucial in correcting these misunderstandings. When people read the actual words of the pilots, see the photographs of these young men petting dogs and writing to their mothers, it becomes impossible to maintain the cartoon image of the mindless fanatic. These were human beings, teenagers and young men who loved their families, feared death, and found themselves in circumstances that gave them no good choices. Lessons for our time. What lessons can we draw from the kamikaze program more than 7 decades later? In an age when suicide attacks remain a global security concern, when nationalism continues to drive conflicts, when young people are still being radicalized and sent to their deaths, the story of the kamikaze pilots offers important insights. First, it demonstrates the power of systematic propaganda and social pressure to overcome the basic human instinct for survival. Most kamikaze pilots didn't want to die, but they flew their missions anyway because the alternative, dishonor, shame for their families, accusations of cowardice, seemed worse than death. This should make us deeply skeptical of any system that glorifies sacrifice and martyrdom, that teaches young people that dying for a cause is the highest form of honor. Second, it shows how easily military leadership can become disconnected from the human costs of its decisions. The officers who designed the kamikaze program could speak glibly of human bullets and divine wind because they weren't the ones climbing into those cockpits. They weren't the ones writing farewell letters to their mothers. Distance from consequence enables moral blindness. Third, The Kamikaze program demonstrates how even deeply patriotic, duty-bound young people can be exploited by cynical leadership. Most kamikaze pilots genuinely loved their country and wanted to protect their families. That love and that desire to protect were weaponized against them, used to manipulate them into accepting deaths that served no meaningful strategic purpose. Fourth, it reveals how cultural values can be twisted to serve destructive ends. Japanese culture's emphasis on duty, honor, and family obligation are not inherently bad things. But in the context of the Kamikaze program, these values became tools of manipulation, ways to pressure young men into choices they might not otherwise have made. The Kamikaze program failed strategically. It didn't save Japan from defeat. It didn't prevent the invasion of Okinawa or the eventual occupation of the home islands. What it did do was kill nearly 4,000 young Japanese men, many of them teenagers, for no meaningful gain. It stripped Japan of a generation of educated, capable young men who could have helped rebuild the country after the war. And perhaps most poignantly, it left behind thousands of letters, physical evidence of young men trying to make sense of senseless deaths, trying to comfort the families they were abandoning, trying to find meaning in a sacrifice that had no meaning. Those letters remain preserved in museums, a permanent testament to the human cost of militarism and nationalism taken to their logical extreme. When we read the letter from a pilot to his mother asking her not to cry, promising that if there's another life, he'll be her son again, we're not reading the words of a fanatic eager for death. We're reading the words of a frightened young man trying to comfort his mother, even as he prepares to die, trying to make his death bearable for the woman who gave him life. There's profound love in those words, but also profound tragedy. The Kamikaze program, stripped of propaganda and mythology, stands as one of history's clearest examples of war's terrible waste. It consumed thousands of young lives, inflicted trauma on tens of thousands of family members, and accomplished essentially nothing of strategic value. The divine wind of 1281 had saved Japan from invasion without costing Japanese lives. The human divine wind of 1944 to 1945 cost thousands of lives and saved nothing. Conclusion. So what should we make of the kamikaze pilots? Were they heroes or victims, fanatics or ordinary young men caught in extraordinary circumstances? The answer, as with most complex historical questions, is that they were all of these things and none of them. Human beings too complicated to fit into simple categories. They were heroes in the sense that flying towards certain death, whatever your motivations, requires courage. The fear they felt was real, the psychological burden immense. To climb into that cockpit, knowing you would never climb out again, took a kind of bravery, even if that bravery was driven by social pressure rather than personal conviction. They were victims in the sense that most had little real choice in their fate. The combination of military discipline, cultural expectations, family honor, and systematic propaganda created a situation where saying no was psychologically impossible for most young men. They were victims of a military leadership that valued abstract concepts like honor more than human lives, that preferred futile gestures to rational acceptance of defeat. They were certainly not fanatics, despite decades of propaganda suggesting otherwise. The letters they left behind, the diaries they kept, the testimony of survivors, all paint a picture of normal young men who loved their families, feared death, and were deeply ambivalent about their missions. Some found ways to accept their fate with grace and dignity, but acceptance is not the same as enthusiasm. Above all, they were human. They laughed and cried, loved and feared, hoped and despaired. They petted dogs and wrote poetry and thought about the lives they would never live. They worried about their parents growing old, about sweethearts they would never marry, about children who would grow up not knowing them. In this, they were exactly like young men everywhere, which is what makes their deaths so tragic. The final letters of kamikaze pilots make us cry not because they're filled with noble sentiments about sacrifice and duty, though some of those sentiments are present. They make us cry because they're so heartbreakingly normal, so filled with ordinary human concerns, so poignant in their recognition that death is coming for these young writers, and there's nothing they can do to stop it. When a 19-year-old pilot writes to his mother asking her to forgive him for not being a better son, when a young husband apologizes to his wife for being cold-hearted and leaving her alone, when a father tells his infant daughter to visit his shrine if she wants to know him, these aren't the words of mindless zealots. These are the words of people like us, caught in circumstances we can barely imagine, trying to maintain their humanity even as they prepare to throw away their lives. The Kamikaze program stands as a warning about the dangers of nationalism, militarism, and the worship of sacrifice. It shows what happens when a society values honor and duty over human life, when military leaders become so committed to their ideology that they're willing to consume their own young people rather than admit defeat. It demonstrates how propaganda can transform voluntary choice into coercion, how social pressure can override individual conscience, how cultural values can be weaponized to serve destructive ends. But more than a warning, the Kamikaze pilot's letters serve as a reminder of humanity's persistence, even in the face of inhumanity. These young men, ordered to stop being human and become weapons, refused in the most fundamental way. They wrote letters expressing love, fear, hope, and regret. They showed concern for their family's well-being. They apologized for perceived failings. They wished for other lives where they could be better sons, husbands, fathers. In doing so, they reclaimed their humanity from a system that tried to deny it. They left behind evidence, thousands of pieces of paper covered with their own handwriting, that they were people, not weapons, that their deaths were tragedies, not glorious sacrifices, that they should be remembered and mourned, not celebrated as exemplars of martial virtue. Today, if you visit the Chiran Peace Museum, you'll see those letters under glass. You'll see the photographs of young men, some smiling, some serious, all of them long dead. You'll see the stone lanterns, over 1,000 of them, each representing a life cut short. And if you're paying attention, if you let yourself really see what's in front of you, you'll understand that the Kamikaze pilots weren't alien others from a strange culture. They were young men like young men everywhere who wanted to live, who loved their families, who had dreams and fears and hopes. They just had the profound misfortune to be born in Japan in the 1920s and early 1930s, to come of age during a time of militarism and aggressive war, to be caught up in a conflict that would consume them entirely. Their final letters, written in the hours before they flew to their deaths, stand as testaments to their humanity, their individuality, their refusal to be reduced to propaganda symbols or military statistics. So when we ask whether the Kamikaze were heroes or victims, fanatics or tragic figures, perhaps we're asking the wrong question. Perhaps the right question is simply, do we see them as human? Do we recognize in their words and their deaths something of ourselves, something universal in their love for their families and their fear of death? If we can do that, if we can see past the mythology to the men themselves, then maybe their letters will have served their purpose, preserving their humanity across 7 decades and an ocean of cultural difference. The Kamikaze pilots wrote their letters knowing they would die, hoping their words would be remembered. Let's honor that hope by remembering them not as the caricatures of propaganda, but as the complex, flawed human individuals they truly were. Young men who didn't want to die, but who faced death with what dignity they could muster, who loved their families to the very end, and who left behind words that still have the power to make us cry 70 years later. If you found this story moving, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. These stories from World War II matter, not just as history, but as reminders of what humans are capable of, both terrible and beautiful. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on the Kamikaze pilots and their legacy. And as always, thank you for watching.